Hello and welcome to this Royal Scottish Geographical Society event. My name is Dr. Vanessa Collingridge and I've come all the way down from Scotland to Dorset in the West Country to interview perhaps one of the world's most famous explorers. His name, of course, is Colonel John Blashford-Snell, OBE. John, thank you so much for having us here today. I'd like to start off really with your earliest memories and earliest days. Now, not many kids growing up when they have their school careers advisor would hear the words, "John, I think you should grow up to be an explorer." So I'm interested in how the whole exploration idea came about. Was that always something you wanted to do?
Through my parents. My father was in the church, but he, having been born in Jersey, he married my mother, who was English, and at an early age, trying to get ordained, he went out to New Zealand, and they were ordained in Dunedin. And at the same time, he joined the New Zealand Army because he needed some money. So he became the chaplain of this Balclutha Yeomanry in South Island, New Zealand. And when they came back to England eventually, I arrived, and I was born actually in Herefordshire, but Jersey was my real home because as soon as possible I went back over there to school. But my father and mother were great scouts and guides, and they told endless stories about their times in New Zealand and the Pacific, and the things they'd done with the Boy Scouts and girls. When I went out to New Zealand many years later, I did actually meet some of the, by now, rather elderly guides and scouts who'd been with my parents on their various expeditions up into the Blue Mountains and so on. And I think that really sparked my first interest. And my godfather also was quite an explorer, who I got to know later in life. And he'd one time, his proud boast, he'd ridden a horse from Cape Town to Cairo in about 1911 when he was in the army, but he was finishing his tour as ADC to the governor of South Africa, and he and a pal decided that they'd do a bit of a hike. So they took horses and they rode all the way to Cairo, stopping on the way, here and there to meet friends. It was quite a journey in those days. So that was really the family background, and there were lots of talks, and the vicarage when I grew up was always full of mementos, and there were sort of various animals' heads and assegais and spears and Maori clubs and so on that my father and mother had brought back. So that was the start.
So there was always the allure of the wider world out there then?
Oh, very much. And later on, when I went, being brought up in Jersey, of course, it's a small island. You've got to get out. And you were encouraged to be adventurous. We had a wonderful school, Victoria College, and we used to go clambering around the cliffs in the north of the island. And then, of course, diving started. And our great hero was Jacques Cousteau. And he was becoming very well known. He'd invented the aqualung. And we boys wanted to dive underwater. We couldn't afford an aqualung, so we built one ourselves.
How did you build one?
Well, we got hold of, there was a lot of German equipment lying around in Jersey from the occupation during the war. And one of my friends got hold of a Draga kit, which was a submarine escape apparatus. And he converted this for diving underwater. And he said to me, "Well, I want you to try it out." And it was meant to have sort of soda lime in a canister to turn the carbon dioxide back into oxygen. It was how the system worked. And so he put this thing on me, rather like a gas mask, and tied a belt around my waist with some nets full of house bricks to act as weights, and sank me in the sea just off St. Bullard's harbour. And he stood on the harbour wall, the rope attached to me, and said, "When you're in trouble, just give a pull when you want to come up, and I'll pull you back up." Well, down I went, not very far, probably only about 10 or 12 feet underwater. And the taste of the air coming in got worse and worse and worse. And this is killing me. obviously he hadn't got the mixture of soda lime right, or whatever it was. And so I pulled hard on the rope, and to my horror, the rope snaked down from the surface. There was nothing on the end of it. So then I had to try to get the nets full of house bricks tied around my waist off, and I couldn't get them off. So then I had to do a sort of alpine climb underwater up the side of the harbour wall, to desperately trying to breathe, and eventually poked my head out of the water and gasped. When I looked up, there was Tony chatting to two girls on the top. He'd completely forgotten about me, and he'd met these two girls and found them more amusing than me.
So we're lucky to have you here today, then, is what you're saying?
So it was a very adventurous sort of life, and the school was encouraged adventure, and as I say, whether it was boating or climbing or diving. And when I went eventually into the Royal Engineers, I became a diver, but that time I was based in Cyprus, which of course was a very nice place to dive. And when I was posted back to England, they said, "Would you like to go on diving?" And I said, "Where?" And they said, "Well, we need a chap at Southampton Water." I thought, no, it doesn't feel the same. So I went into more conventional Royal Engineering after that.
Now, it was through the army, wasn't it, that you went on your first real expedition, your first official expedition. Tell me how that came about, the Blue Nile.
Well, when I arrived at Sandhurst, the general, who was a Canadian and a very adventurous man, had me in. He said, "You're going to be the adventurous training officer." And I'd already been involved with outward bound training, and I'd been an instructor for a short time at an outward bound school. And so he said, "You're the chap who's going to do this job. Do you know what is involved?" And I said, "No, General." He said, "Well, I want you to get as many of these young men overseas for the benefit of their character and the least possible detriment to the empire, and do something useful with them." So I then set up an office and said, "Who wants to go on expeditions?" Well, there were 900 cadets at Sandhurst, and they were all as keen as mustard. And we started sending teams of officer cadets during their long vacation, which they had in those days. And they went overseas and they built schools and caught bugs and beetles and snakes and did various scientific studies. We set up a relationship with the Natural History Museum, and they loved people to go collecting bugs and beetles for them. And that, of course, led on, and eventually I started leading expeditions myself, taking some of the cadets. Very luckily, my godfather had looked after Haile Selassie during the war, and he was always being invited back, and he went sometimes. But I thought, well, perhaps I could get an invitation from Haile Selassie, and we could take officer cadets to do a natural history expedition in Ethiopia. So godfather wrote to the emperor, and the emperor replied, "Send him out." So I went out there with a load of cadets, and we had a wonderful expedition collecting things for the museum. And then the next expedition we went again, it got even bigger. This time there were 60 officer cadets. And right at the end, when we went to say goodbye to Haile Selassie, he leant forward and said to me, "I do hope you will return to my empire." And I said, "Well, of course, and what would you like us to do?" And he said, "I would like you to explore my Blue Nile." And well, he didn't call it Blue Nile, he called it the Great Abai. And that was what really started. And I sort of muttered a few things. I thought, this is perhaps a bit beyond me. And I went back to the army in England, and I was posted to the Royal Military College of Science at Trivenham, where the general, who was a rather interesting little man, and he was little, called Napier Crookenden, General Sir Napier Crookenden, a very fiery character. And he'd received this letter through the Ministry of Defence from Haile Selassie. And he called me in and he said, "We've had a letter from Haile Selassie, King of Kings, chosen lion of the tribe of Judah, and he's a field marshal in the British Army." And he said, "You met him?" I said, "Yes, General, I have." And he said, "He wants his Blue Nile explored, and you've seen it." I said, "Well, I have, General, but only briefly. Looking down from a bridge, I don't know it well." "What do you think of it?" I said, "Well, it's full of crocodiles, very big ones, and they're quite aggressive, and lots of angry hippopotamus, and they have landslides that are said to contain radioactive gas, and it's full of bandits who are hiding down there in this great gorge, which is a mile deep." He said, "You're being rather negative." He said, "I don't like negative officers. I've decided this is just the sort of expedition that's good for morale. We haven't had a war lately. We should go and do it." So he said, "We'll have a committee. All good expeditions have committees." He said, "I shall be chairman and you will be secretary, and I see no need for anyone else." So that was the start of the Blue Nile expedition.
So it was a character building exercise as much as an exploration exercise.
So we were given full backing of the army, and the Daily Telegraph came in to support it, and later Anglia Television made the film of it. And we did have a very, very adventurous, sometimes too adventurous time. Sadly, one of our men was drowned, who was a Scot, Ian MacLeod, who was a corporal in the SAS. We had a couple of little fracas with local bandits, but being soldiers we were armed, so we were able to fight our way out. We had one or two meetings with very large crocodiles, but we came out, and all the scientists who came with us, and there were a lot of them, of course, were overjoyed because they produced 76 scientific papers on their discoveries. And so the expedition went down as a great success, and then the general back at Sandhurst, my original general, said to me, he was by now a very senior general, he said, "You know, we can't keep funneling money for these expeditions through various army charities. You've got to set up a charity of your own." And so that was the founding of the Scientific Exploration Society.
Going back to the Blue Nile expedition, obviously the covert mission was to develop character and train people, I suppose, in overcoming adversity, what we'd call resilience building today. But scientifically, was there a bigger purpose? How well had it been mapped at the time?
There were bits of it had been mapped. A Major Cheeseman had gone down in 1925 along the banks, but because the gorge was a mile deep, you couldn't see the river in places. There was always cloud over the bottom, so you just looked down into this abyss. And Cheeseman made map parts of it. Various other expeditions tried to get down. And of course, the Scots explorer James Bruce had come in the 1700s, and he had found the source of the Blue Nile, which was a little stream up in the mountains. But he didn't go down the river. He couldn't. There was no way down it. There was no way of getting along through the rapids and the gorge. You needed a special type of craft. And of course, it wasn't until 1968 that we found that you could use inflatable boats. And I went to the Avon Company and said, "We'd like to go down the worst river in the world. Would you lend us some of your yachting tenders?" And they made these for boats. And they didn't like the idea very much, but they said, "Well, why don't you take one, test it?" And so I took one of their yachting tenders up to a weir in Wales, and we put it over the top of the weir about 40 times, and we didn't puncture it. And later on, we developed a valve in the side through which we could put football bladders. So you had tubes within tubes, so we had a virtually unsinkable boat. They worked pretty well, but we also had larger craft, big Royal Engineer assault boats, 16 foot long. And we used those on parts of the river the rapids were not too bad. And then where the rapids were severe, we used these inflatables. And I've still got one in the workshop here that goes back to 1968, and it still floats. And that was, of course, when people saw the film, it started this idea of whitewater rafting.
And I was going to say, because you are credited with starting the whole genre of whitewater rafting that, of course, is so popular today. So is that true then?
Well, by accident, yes. I mean, I think we survived, and the film was pretty dramatic. And we went on to develop more and more inflatables, and of course eventually ended up with this giant one that you've seen here, which is 40 feet long. And I mean, that was all part of the success story.
Now, you've mentioned that there were angry hippopotamus, there were crocodiles, was it? But that wasn't the only kind of danger, was it, on your expeditions along the Blue Nile?
No, I mean, the fact was there were quite a lot of local bandits, shifter, whatever you call them, who didn't want to pay income tax, and I had some sympathy with them. And they were anti-government. and there was a sort of minor civil war going on at the time, as happens all the time in Ethiopia. And we'd been warned about this, and we did run into one or two people who were mildly hostile. But nothing really happened until we got into the northern gorges. And then one day when we were doing a geological survey, and we pulled into a rather convenient little creek at one side, and across the river there was this amazing cave that was halfway up a cliff. And how the devil have people got into this cave? Because you could see a man-made wall across the front of it. And Chris Bonington and one or two other members of the team who were climbers said, well, if you can take a boat and hold it at full speed, we can jump from the side of the boat onto the cliff face and sort of go up the cliff face into the cave, which sounded a crazy idea, but they were good climbers. And so that's what we did, and we sent the climbers in. Meanwhile, I wasn't going to jump onto the cliff face. I was the wrong shape. But I went up with the geologists to look at some copper deposits further up the creek. And whilst I was there, there was a bang, and a bullet hit the rock about a foot above my head. And I looked up, and there was a chap at the top of the cliff with a rifle. And I shouted at him, "Watch out, you might have hit me." And then I suddenly realised that's what he was trying to do. So I ran back into the camp, by which time, fortunately, the climbers had all returned. And I said, I think we should get packed and get out of here. The people are looking pretty hostile. And at that moment, the other side of the gorge, about 40 people stood up along the side, armed to the teeth, and started to fire into the camp. And luckily, I had a loud hailer. And so I put this loud hailer up and shouted at the chap who I thought must be the leader, because he was wearing, funny enough, a pith helmet as well. And I said, in the few words of Amharic that I knew, "Tenasteling, tenasteling, we come in peace. Would you like a Mars bar?" Because we had a lot of Mars bars. And to my amazement, they all stopped shooting. I suppose they were completely perplexed by this funny voice coming out of the gorge. And the chap who was leading him took his pith helmet off and bowed to me, and so I took mine off and bowed to him. Then the wretched chap put his rifle up and fired, and he put the bullet between my feet. So at that point, I decided we should get out, and so everyone jumped into their boats. And I said to the naval officer, "You take our boat and go upstream and try and draw their fire." And he did, very much in the spirit of Nelson. And he went up. And then I realised I'd sent all the other boats downstream, so I'm now still on the beach. My boat's gone upstream, so I've got no boat. At this point, several other sort of bandits appeared and started to come down after me. And we had an exchange of fire with my pistol against them. And then, luckily, the naval officer came back and shouted, "Get in, you fool!" And I ran into the water, jumped over the side of the boat. I took only one thing with me, which was a can of petrol, which I thought would be more vital. And sadly, I left behind all the archaeological specimens that we'd found. And we shot downriver, and we had, again, there was quite a lot of shooting going on down, and we had to fire back. And we managed eventually to get out of this ambush. The only one who was hurt was Chris Bonington, who was fiddling around with his cameras, and he got hit by a slingshot which cracked a rib. But these slingshot, they were better with them than they were with their guns, and these pebbles were hitting the sides of the boats, doing pong, sort of bouncing off the rubber boats. And we then went on downriver for about 25 miles and found an island, made a camp. 3 young men from one side swam over to us, and they were stark naked, wearing nothing but a Coptic cross. And they were pretty courageous because the river was teeming with crocodiles. And I thought that they were taking an undue interest in how many guns we had. And so I was rather suspicious of this. And when they'd gone off with their Mars bars and whatever we gave them, I said, well, I think we should build a zareba, a thorn fence around the camp for tonight, and put 2 sentries on. And during the night, about 1 o'clock in the morning, suddenly I heard somebody shouting, "Stand to, stand to." And I was in a deep sleep. And half the time you think, I'm dreaming about what happened at midday. And out of the darkness came one of the second sentry we'd sent out, who was an officer in the Green Howards, and he was running up the beach being pursued by about 10 people, one of whom had a large saw, but he was trying to cut our friend's head off. And the second officer who was on duty was a chap called David Bromhead, who was a direct descendant of Bromhead VC of Rorke's Drift. And David, fortunately, was a very good shot. And just as poor old Roger reached the fence and was trying to climb over, and the man behind was about to cut his head off, David put up his pistol and fired, and the chap received a 45 caliber bullet in the middle, and that was the end of him. But that saved Roger's life. And then all the other bandits who saw this man fall, and they dressed back, but they didn't run away. They were very courageous people, and they kept on coming. And meanwhile, on the bank, a whole group more had appeared and were bombarding us. And we were ridiculous, 10 people sitting on an island with no cover, really. And luckily it was dark. But the one key weapon that we had was a mini flare launcher. And these are the things that mountaineers and yachtsmen carry and so on. And so we fired these mini flares horizontally, trying to set fire to the grass behind these people. But I think they were more frightened of the mini flares than they were of the bullets, because they could see this flare rushing at them. And that held them back. And then we realized we weren't going to be able to hold out for long. And so we pulled back to the end of the island. Meanwhile, the naval officer had very courageously gone up a tree, got the aerial down, and then took his boat between the firing lines. He really was a pretty remarkable chap. And we all ended up on the end of the island. We said, right, well, we'll stay here until the last attack, and then we'll get out. And when it came, we said, right, out. And I had with me the historian, Richard Snellam. And I remember going around to people saying, you cover from A to B, from that rock to that tree, and so on, and checking out how many rounds of ammunition have you got left, and so on. And I went up to Dick and said, Dick, you know your orders. You only fire when they're very close, and make sure you know who you're firing at. He said, there is a small academic point I want to raise. I said, God, what is it, man? He said, I don't have a gun. And so he was standing there with his Swiss penknife in his hand. So I said, well, take my hat. And I had a pith helmet like this one here. So I handed him my hat, and I said, look after it, because I don't want to wear it to give my position away. So he stuffed this under his shammer thing he was wearing. And at that point, we got into the boats, and we then went down the rapids in the pitch black, which is not a good thing to do. And we hit a big rapid, and one boat flipped over straight away. The boat I was in was one of the motorized ones that has now joined us, and it was sinking fast. And I thought we'd taken a bullet in the bow, but I think it was probably a valve. And so the naval officer who was piloting my boat said, we're going astern. And he took us astern, and we crashed into a sandbank. And I shot out, and I landed on something that was long and scaly. And it was a crocodile. And the crocodile was probably more surprised than I was. And it shot off into the water. And we got the boats ashore, and we managed to mend the leak. And then we had one or two other problems with the propellers and so on. And meanwhile, we could see our little camp burning, and we could see all the bandits were making fun running around it. And as dawn came up, we picked up the crew of the upturned boat who were a bit further downstream, and we went off. And we were going happily downriver when suddenly we saw this whole regiment of crocodiles. And the crocodile zoologist who was with us, who was a real expert, said, we got to watch out for these chaps. And they were big. They were about 18 feet long. And I grabbed the one heavy rifle we had and stood up. And he said, don't shoot. He said, they're only curious. They won't hurt you. And these animals came like torpedoes out from the side. And they headed straight for the boat. And I held my fire, as the scientists had told me. And you could feel them passing under the rubber boats, scraping under. And they came up alongside, and they were sort of as close as you and I are. And the geologist with us had enough, so he picked up the sack of geological specimens and hit the nearest crocodile over the head, burst the sack. We lost all the geological specimens. But the crocodiles didn't attack. And eventually they just quietly swam away, and we didn't have to shoot any, and that was that. And so we went on downstream, and we came around a corner, and the whole river was full of hippopotamus. And we said, oh my God. But I always remembered when we'd been to the Natural History Museum for a briefing, the one thing they said was, do not go near hippopotamus in the mating season. And I said, well, when is the mating season? Well, they said, we're not too sure about that, but perhaps when you come back, you can tell us. So we just went very, very slowly past these hippo, and they all grunted and looked at us. And some of our boats were jet black, so they did look a bit like female hippos. And we eventually got through the hippos. And then we came round a corner, and there, to our sheer joy, was one of the Royal Engineer assault boats that had come up all the way from downriver, having heard we were in trouble, to help us. And a friend of mine was piloting, and he'd managed to jump the rapids and come up. And we then had some resupplies and so on, but we had no food, and so we had a difficult few days. And in the end, the crocodile expert said, well, all right. He said, I want one specimen anyway. So he agreed to shoot one crocodile, which he did. And we shot a nice size, about 7'6", and we ate the tail. But we had nothing to cook it in, and we just put it on a sheet of tin, and we put some engine oil on it and fried it in engine oil, which I don't recommend. But that was how we eventually got back to the big bridge where we'd started, and that was the end of the expedition.
So despite losing the archaeological samples, losing the geological samples, eating some of the zoological samples, that obviously whetted your appetite for this scientific expeditioning that then morphed into the Scientific Exploration Society.
Yes.
And so what were the goals of that? Because, I mean, it's fantastic hearing all the tales of daring do and all the great escapades. Not to say that they were always pleasant. I'm sure better relived than experienced first time round. But what were you trying to do with this formal Scientific Exploration Society?
The fact was that the services had a lot of hell-bent adventurous characters who were good at field administration and could handle logistics. We'd already established a very good relationship, particularly with the Natural History Museum and also with people like Kew Gardens and so on, who were so eager to get out. It was like, to be, after all, suddenly to be said, you can go to the Blue Nile, which they couldn't before. All these botanists and biologists and archaeologists were saying, blimey, what a chance. And when we said it's free, you can imagine it was being offered a chance to fly to the moon. So the idea of the SES, as it was formed, was to bring together the service explorers and the scientists to work together for the general benefit of mankind. And the soldiers obviously had the adventurous time, and the scientists got their results. And so we went on carrying out various programs for the Natural History Museum, Kew Gardens and so on over the years, and that's continued to this day. And basically what we're dealing with is archaeology, biology, botany, zoology. But we've also, in more recent times, started doing medical work. And that started because one particular expedition, we had teams of ophthalmic doctors and people who wanted to carry out eye operations for cataract and pterygia. And so they started joining the expeditions and operating on people in the field. And that, of course, made you so welcome, because when suddenly you turn up with a doctor and also with a dentist, and the dentists were even more wanted than the eye operators. And so today, the whole thing has really developed into taking not only scientists, but taking doctors and dentists to do work with the local people.
Because that very much is the difference, isn't it, between just adventurers, and explorers come scientists as well. There is a distinct purpose. It's not entitled white men going around in pith helmets.
No, it wasn't. No. No, the pith helmet was a good idea because it is actually the most perfect headwear for certain things. I mean, my head was saved once when I went off a mule headfirst into a tree. If I hadn't had a pith helmet on, I wouldn't be here now. It's a very good crash helmet. And it's also very good if you want to catch a snake, because you can actually drop the pith helmet on top of it. If it's a small snake, and the snake will curl itself up in the pith helmet, and then you've got the snake. And I used my pith helmet on several occasions to catch snakes for the herpetologist. This big pith helmet's very good at that, but as long as the snake's not too big.
So how do you regard adventurers then? Somebody who just wants to go off and have a good time. Is that still legitimate, or should there always be a purpose?
Well, I would hope that more and more would actually add a purpose to having a good time, whether they're raising money for a good cause. And I think today, generally, most people who go expeditions do have a purpose behind it. I mean, there are some who will still want to go to the South Pole or the North Pole, but I've seen that the majority of them are taking readings on, say, the shrinking of the ice, or today, of course, the problems of pollution. And most of the expeditions that we handle through the SES have got a scientific purpose, but they may also be at the same time quite adventurous.
Now, of course, one of the other organisations that you were fundamental in setting up was Operation Drake and then Operation Rally.
Yeah.
How did they come about? Because they weren't dealing with grown-ups, they were dealing with younger people.
Well, the Operation Drake came about because the Prince of Wales was very, very keen to do something to develop leadership in young people. And he made I think it was his maiden speech at the House of Lords, when he said that young people want the challenges of war in peacetime, and God forbid there should be a war. And he met 2 or 3 of the young officers who'd been on the Congo River expedition with me, and they were equerries to him, and they were telling him all about the things they'd done, and the fact that we had about 30 scientists on that, working with various tasks for the museums and so on. And he said, well, this sounds just like the sort of thing that we can do with young people. And we'd had 2 or 3 young people with us. And after they came back from the Congo, they had gone round to schools and universities trying to inspire other young people with this sort of Elizabethan spirit of adventure, at the same time as doing something scientific. So Prince of Wales asked me to come to see him, and he said, can you design an expedition to do all this? So we got together, and the SES came up with this idea of putting together all the expeditions that we were thinking about, and said, if we had a ship, we could go around the world and do them one after the other, and we could advertise for young people. And we went back to the Prince and said, well, this is the plan. And he said, what will it cost? And I said, well, about £900,000. What? He said, that's ridiculous. Well, he didn't really understand quite the value of money, I think, at those days. He said, but if I help you, do you think you could do it? I said, well, so if you could write a letter or 2, it might help. So he agreed to be patron and to try and raise funds for us. And he then went on television, and he said that anyone who was fit, compatible, could speak English and swim, could have this chance of a lifetime if they were 17 to 25. Well, you can imagine the effect. 58,000 applied.
For how many places?
58,000 for 400.
Whoa.
So we then had to set up all these selection tests. And I always say we based it on the KGB handbook, because the great thing was to get people together and get them cold and wet and miserable, frightened and furious and so on. And then you found out about their character and whether they were potential leaders. So we set up testing centres, not only in Britain, we were talking about Commonwealth countries and indeed America. And the testing centres got people in at the weekend. I remember the first one that we had was down in Kent, and the youngsters arrived early in the morning, freezing cold February day. 1 or 2 of the girls were in sort of high-heeled boots. And we said, right, take your watches off, hand in your watches, no one's allowed to watch. Well, that, of course, easy way to disorientate someone. And then we said, now you're in the wrong place. The real place is 5 miles over those fields. No one offered them a cup of tea or anything, and they marched through the fields. Eventually they got to a pond where there was a broken down punt. And we said, right, you, pointing to one of them, you've broken both your legs, tie his legs together. Now, you're being pursued by hostile bandits. He's broken his leg, you've got to get him across the pond in this punt, which has got a hole in it. So they put the casualty into the punt, and of course it started to leak as soon as they put it in the water. And to make it more realistic, we'd got a crocodile, which was an electric one, which came down the bank, and it was so cold the thing froze halfway. So then we turned on a recording with a megaphone of gibbons screaming in the jungles of Borneo. But this, it was almost snowing at this time, so it wasn't terribly realistic. And finally, when we got to the far side, we said, right, now that's all for the day. You can have a tent to put up. And we gave them a tent, which, of course, we dipped in the pond first. And we said, put your tent up and you can have a meal. And it was quite late in the afternoon by now, and they were desperately hungry and cold. And we gave them a rabbit and a pigeon with all their furs and feathers on, and said, right, prepare it and eat it. And by this time, they were almost tearing it apart with their teeth. And then we said, you can go to bed now. And some of them believed us that nothing was going to happen that night. So they got into bed. And you waited till about 1 o'clock in the morning, where the KGB handbook said that's the time to really find out about someone's character. And then you woke them up with shouting and screaming and loud music and so on, and said, there's been a terrible accident up on the road. You must go and help the police. So off they staggered through the woods, freezing cold. When they got there was a police car, and the policeman was just sitting there quietly having a cigarette. And he said, what do you want? I said, come to help you. You're too late. It's all finished. Go home. So thoroughly disheartened, they go back to their tents. And you give them about 10 minutes to go back to sleep. And we always used to say, watch the eyelids. Because when the eyelids are flickering at a certain rate is when they're in the deepest sleep. And that is just the time you wake them up. And you say, quick, quick, quick. There's been a terrible accident up on the motorway. We've got to go and help the police. And off they went. This time, St. John Ambulance had set up a very realistic motor accident with a motorcyclist lying injured in the field. The motorcycle crashed on the road. Police car had gone into the ditch. Policeman had injured his leg getting out. And we said, here, you've come on this terrible accident. Now, what are you going to do to sort it out? And there were all the judges walking around with their fur coats, taking notes on their character. And when we got them back to their tent, the last test we wanted to do was to find out whether they had courage. And I've always believed that you can't have courage without fear. So somehow we had to find a way of making people scared stiff. But how could you do this? And health and safety didn't exist in those days just as well. And we said to my zoologist who was helping me, what do you think? He said, well, most people are frightened of some animal or other. And so he said, I'll find you a few animals. So off he went to talk to the zoo or whatever it was. And anyway, in the middle of the night, we took these youngsters two at a time to this barn. And we said, right, inside this barn, there is a wild animal. It's quite safe if you handle it carefully. And all we want you to do is to weigh it and measure it and so on. And here's a bathroom scales and a tape and a torch. And they went in, and the first candidate was a young policewoman who has been with me on expeditions ever since. But she was about 18 at the time. And as they went in, she lifted some carpets in one corner, and she jumped up. Beneath the carpet was a 12-foot python. And she said, I hate snakes. I can't touch that thing. And Monty, as we called him, came out, and he was going across the carpet with his tongue flickering in the light. And we said, well, think of this opportunity of a lifetime. 3 months, high adventure, all expenses paid. And she looked around, and as I say, it was in Kent, so she found a cricket bat that was lying around, and she tried to get the python onto the bathroom scales. But the head went one way and the tail went the other, and it didn't work. And finally that girl bent down, and she picked up this snake, wrapped it around herself, stood on the bathroom scales, and of course that was it. Well, that showed she had courage. Unfortunately, the newspapers made headlines, of course, of this. And so we had to change the act. So I borrowed a tarantula from another friend, another scientist who was helping. And he had Fifi, who was about the size of a dinner plate. And we played Past the Spider. And you put Fifi in her box, and everyone had to lie down. The boys had to take their shirts off, and you had to coax Fifi out of the box, and up your arm, across your chest, down the other arm, onto the next person. And so Fifi went along the line. They all passed. Then we went to Jersey. And when we got there, Gerald Durrell was alive. And Jerry said, "Oh, I'll give you a few tests at the zoo." And he took them to the gorilla cage. And there was, I think his name was Solomon, an enormous beast. And he said, "This is a very angry mountain gorilla."
Is there any other kind than an angry mountain gorilla?
And he was beating his chest, and he really put on... and then he said, "I'm going to put you in the pen with the one that made him mad." And he said, "I want you to take her vital statistics. Here's a measuring tape." So he put 2 youngsters at a time in the pen, and the female gorilla, there's a photograph of her up there, who was about 200 pounds in weight, came in, and she was perfectly tame. She'd been brought up by the keepers, but the keepers had taught her all sorts of little tricks. And one of them was that if she wanted a chocolate biscuit, all she had to do was go up to the nearest human, put her arms around them, and give them a passionate kiss. And if you've never faced an amorous female gorilla, I mean, some people may have done, I don't know, but it's quite frightening. But the worst thing was to happen was, of course, that if she didn't get the biscuit, she was taught that you were hiding the biscuit in your trouser pocket. And that got quite scary. But eventually they all passed. And we had other tests as well, moving cows and bullocks. And one lovely one I used to love, we used to put people in a stable with a pig that had been covered in Vaseline. And they had to catch the pig.
How did you think these things up?
Well, it was the scientists who thought them up.
Oh, it was nothing to do with me, Your Honour. It was the scientists.
There's a chap called Andrew Mitchell, who was from Scotland, actually. He had all these ideas, and he used to keep coming up with tarantulas and bugs and beetles and things. Because
one of the lesser known facts about you is that is it life president of the Centre for Fortean Zoology. So you've got a bit of a love affair with strange and weird animals, haven't you?
Yes, well, I've always been interested in, the places like that centre. They may appear slightly crazy, but there are genuine scientists who work with them. They're not all completely mad. And if you don't go and look, you won't know whether the thing happens or not. And I mean, one of the things that they've always been interested in is the so-called stories of the Yeti. And we've had people on expeditions who are quite serious about studying it. They don't say it exists, definitely, but they are sufficiently concerned and interested to study it.
And you yourself have come across now, let me just read the name. You rediscovered the double-nosed Andean tiger hound.
Well, the double-nosed Andean tiger hound, there's a picture of it over there, was originally found by Colonel Percy Fawcett in 1913 in Bolivia. And when he came back to England and said that he had found not only a 60-foot anaconda, but also a double-nosed Andean tiger hound, people just laughed him out of existence. Well, I can't speak about the 60-foot anaconda. I've seen some big ones, but not that big. But one day when I was in Bolivia, I actually had a copy of his book with me because we were working in an area where he'd been. And we were sitting after a very exhausting march by a fire talking to the local schoolmaster. And there were some dogs around the side, just lying there. And suddenly I looked at one of these dogs. Oh, there was something funny about its face. I got up and walked over to it, and it had got, there's a picture of it on the wall, divided nostrils. I said, blimey, this is the thing that Fawcett found. So I said to the schoolmaster, where did you get this dog? Oh, he said, I bought it. And he said, you do get them around here. So I realised, because we were in a very similar place where Fawcett had made it discovered they did exist. And I said, well, what do you use the dog for? Oh, he said, hunting. He said, they've got a wonderful sense of smell.
Not surprising with 2 noses.
Yeah, well, and the result of that was we came back to England with these pictures and said Fawcett was right. He wasn't telling complete lies. He actually did see these things, and they do exist. So I knew that the Daily Mail were interested. I went to see the Daily Mail, where I had a friend, and he said, blimey, you must go back and find, we'll back the expedition. So the Daily Mail then kindly supported an expedition to go back and find more of these. And we went back and we did in fact find a number over the time. It's a genetic sort of fault with the animal. It's not a new species. And we eventually found one that died shortly afterwards, and so we were able to dissect it. And we couldn't find any real proof that there's any increased sense of smell. But the local people pay $500 for one, and they use them for hunting, and they're convinced that these dogs do have this ability. And in Chile, there's a man breeding them, and the police use them for narcotics work and looking for landmines and so on. And so it was quite fascinating. But as far as I was concerned, the great thing was that Fawcett was right. And maybe he did find a 60-foot anaconda, but I haven't seen that one yet.
Now, it's not just going out to find out about the local area. You've actually taken things with you, and I'm thinking in particular of not just pith helmets, but grand pianos.
There's a tribe in the far end of Guyana called the Wai Wai, and a friend of mine, General Joe Singh, who was the head of the Guyana Defence Force, was very keen to help this tribe because they act as a sort of honorary guardians of his southern border. And he was a blood brother of the tribe, and he said to me they desperately need medical aid and dentists. So we took an expedition of doctors and dentists back to help the tribe. And when we were about to leave, the chief priest of the church there, they had a sort of evangelical church, said to me, when you come back, as I hope you will, would you do us a favour? I said, what is it? He said, would you bring me a grand piano? I said, a grand piano? Have you ever seen a grand piano? He said, I've seen a picture of one. I said, why do you want one? He said, well, the problem is that the young men here, the young warriors, are hearing stories about the bright lights on the coast, which is 350 miles away. And they're getting bored with just living here in the middle of the jungle. They want to go up and see the bright lights and the girls and everything up there. And I know they'll get into trouble because they've got no trade to offer. All they are hunters. And he said, but they are musical. And he said they love playing string instruments and drums and so on. And the church services went on for about 7 hours on a Sunday. So he said, if you could bring a grand piano, we would be the absolute ideal, or it would be the ideal instrument for them to have pride in. Because no one in the Amazon area has got a grand piano. So I said, well, I can't make a promise. I thought it was nuts. Anyway, I went back to England. And I was giving a presentation at a large West End hotel. And I was trying to help this tribe. And I said, they want to sell some of their handicrafts, but the trouble was that most of their handicrafts were made out of endangered species, so we weren't going to get far with that. And then I said at the end, more or less as a joke, and they also want a grand piano. To my horror, the general manager of the group said, we'll give you a grand piano. And there was an airline there called Biwi that flies out to the Caribbean, and they said, yeah, we'll fly to you. And, of course, there were various newspaper people attending. So the next morning, of course, the gossip columns had that I was going to take a grand piano to the tribe. So I was slightly caught on the hook by telling this story. However, I got on to my various Royal Engineer friends and said, what do you think about moving an 800-pound grand piano? And they said, you're nuts, but all things are possible. So we took the piano and we had it tropicalized and we had it disassembled and put into a big crate. And we filmed a team of 10, including a number of scientists, and we also recruited a doctor who was a piano tuner and a pianist. And we said, well, when we get there, if the thing's still working, could you teach the local people? Oh, yes, he said. So that was it. So off we went. Well, when we got to Georgetown, the capital, we made ourselves a mahogany sledge. And then we loaded the grand piano into a little freight aircraft, and we flew it down to a missionary airstrip, which was not too far from the village. And the idea was that about 100 Indians would gather there and help us to pull this grand piano on the sledge to the village. Well, we flew down, we landed, and there were 6 Indians, 3 of whom were children. and this was an £800 piano. So we started with all of us heaving and pulling, and the BBC came along and made a film of it, so they loved it. We were really sweating like hell pulling it. And then we got into the jungle, and we had to build little bridges across crevasses and so on. So it was a hell of a journey, and we eventually collapsed with exhaustion. And the Indians were pretty good. They kept going and kept pulling it. By this time, they got so enthusiastic. And we then realized that they'd moved village, and their next village was on quite a low hill, about 5 or 6 miles away, up through dense jungle. And the old sergeant major I had with me, who was a sapper, said, blimey, we're never going to get through that. We went and looked. He said, you can't get through that jungle. It's impossible. But he said, there's a river, the Essequibo, that runs up there. There's only 1 or 2 rapids. If we could get a boat and we could paddle it upriver, we could get the piano up the river. Luckily, at this point, one of the Indians turned up with a tiny little outboard motor, only 8 horsepower. And we got hold of the biggest dugout canoe we could get. And we loaded the grand piano into this. And then we got up the best speed we could, and we ran it up the rapids. And by a sheer miracle, it didn't turn over. And we then got to the foot of the hill where the new village was established, and found there was a swamp there, and there was no way through that. And how are we going to get this thing onto the land? And then we found some creeks, so we went up, rather like the film from African Queen, and up these creeks with this grand piano, breaking through all the foliage and so on. And there was still just a small group of us. But finally we reached a footpath, and there were 100 Indians. And I said, why didn't you meet us on the airstrip? They said, we didn't think you'd come. So we then used all the Indians, and we heaved it up this mini mountain on its sledge, and singing and dancing around it. And we set it up in the new church was being built. And it was making a few bongs, and we thought, well, all the strings will be broken. But they weren't. It was amazing. The whole thing was in perfect condition. So we put the legs back on and the lyre, and the doctor got to work and retuned it. And then we got the children round and taught them to play it. And that was fantastic. And they played, the film was made, and it was shown all over the world, called The Grand Adventure, after the grand piano. And it's still shown now. I see it on YouTube occasionally. The film was shown. An American charity called Conservation International saw this and said, we ought to preserve this tribe because they are the natural force protecting this rainforest from exploitation by loggers and miners and gold diggers and so on. So they put up $2 million. And they turned the tribe into protectors. All the warriors became game wardens, and all the youths played the piano. And then they sent me another message saying the piano needs retuning. So then I had to do another expedition with adventurous piano tuners. And I got a number of those and sent those out, and we retuned the piano. And we gave a concert over a satellite phone to the BBC of this piano being played. But eventually, of course, the piano just about collapsed, so we then had to provide them with a keyboard and a little generator to run it. But meanwhile, of course, we had kept this tribe going, and I suppose in a way had saved a very large piece of jungle from exploitation.
I was going to ask, following on from that, about the legacy. Again, the stories are fabulous, and I can imagine for those participating in the expeditions, it must have been experiences that literally last a lifetime. But for the societies you're contacting, the communities that you're contacting, and the natural environment, what's the legacy of your lifetime of exploration?
Well, I think the legacy is really what we're trying to do, following on behind Drake and Raleigh, where I'm always getting letters from people who are now, after all, in their 50s and 60s, who were on those expeditions. And many of them have gone on to great places. I mean, for instance, the President of Britain's representative of the United Nations, Barbara Woodward, was an 18-year-old with us, and she's now a dame. The girl who started Bob Geldof on Band-Aid as a nurse and is now a dame and a doctor. and one or two others, including Mike Robinson of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, who were on it. And all these people have gone on, and they're in their way, doing their own thing. I think one of the happiest memories I had was talking to a group of young people in Alaska after one of the rally expeditions, and they just achieved quite a difficult journey in kayaks. I said to them, now you've done all this, you can reach for the stars. And one of them did, and of course that was Tim Peake. And so there have been others too who have really achieved a great deal in life, and are still doing. And there were young people still going through what's now called Rally International. Of course, it's all rather tied up at the moment because of COVID, but it will get going again. And what I'm doing in the meantime, of course, is taking older people, the over 25s or the wrinklies, on expeditions still. And whilst I can still totter, I hope I'm going to do that. So I hope my legacy will continue.
So what's next for you?
Well, we've got 2 expeditions planned and recruited and so on. One is to Mongolia, which was due to go this summer, but has now been postponed to next summer. And that's doing a mixture of archaeology, zoology, botany, biology, and medical aid and dentistry. But it's on horseback. So as soon as you mention expeditions on horses, you get swamped with women who want to come, because more women ride horses than men these days. But we've got a number from Scotland, and including a girl from in Inverurie who's been with me before, who's got her own horses and others. We've got another expedition in Bolivia, which is looking into a particular case of a strange type of alligator that possibly was thought to be extinct. But we discovered that the Bronx Museum had one in 1909, and they were thought to have died out. We met some Indians now who think they've actually seen one. They're a sort of caiman with horns on their nose. So I thought, we found the Loch Ness Monster, but I'm not sure that we have. But it is certainly, from a zoological point of view, it would be wonderful to find a species that isn't extinct and is still there. So that's what we're hoping to do in Bolivia.
In terms of the landscapes that you've encountered and the peoples that you've encountered, what do you think has been, I suppose, your greatest achievement? What are you most proud of in terms of what you've left behind in the places you've explored?
Well, I think the case, as I mentioned, like the Wai Wai, the fact that we were able to preserve a very large stretch of primary rainforest, we can't really be in the exploration business without being a conservationist. And as you say, in the early days, one used to go in for sheer adventure, but of course then you see the whole world being destroyed, and you see the glaciers retreating, and the animals being wiped out. And I think we've all turned very much into being conservationists. I remember one young man walking into my office many years ago, and he was just coming back from Oman, and he said, I want to go on an expedition. And I was very busy at the time, and he said, would the Scientific Exploration Society help me? And I said, what do you want to do? He said, well, I want to take hovercraft up the Nile and do some flag waving or whatever. And I said, well, I hope you're going to do some scientific work. Oh, yes, he said, I will. Anyway, off he went and did it, and his name was Ranulph Fiennes. And of course, he's been doing expeditions ever since. And we've had a number of people like that who've started with us over the years, and not just on Raleigh and Drake, but many of the young. And I remember where we're sitting now one day, I heard a funny noise, and overhead came a strange little flying device with 2 people in it, and it was sort of paramotor, but for 2 people. And it landed in the field where there were a group of them, and the pilot got out, and behind him was a young girl, and he said, this is my sister. And I said, oh yes, how do you do? And I said, are you living here? And she said, oh, I'm at St Mary's School in Shaftesbury. And I said, really? What do they think you're doing? She said, oh, I've told my teacher I'm on a nature walk this afternoon. She appeared flying over the head. Anyway, the next chap who went up got talking to me, and it was Bear Grylls. And Bear had said, I really want to go on to Everest and so on. Well, of course he did, and I knew his parents, and so he started in his way through that, and he's gone on to be Chief Scout. So one is really just a catalyst. So I think I look back on my life so far as being a catalyst for young people, not only from Britain, but all over the world, to go and do something. We've had some amazing Canadians, too, who've done things, and New Zealanders and Australians. So that is what I really think, is giving young people the opportunity. And one of the great things, I think, about the Royal Scottish Geographical Society that I always notice in all their newsletters is how much they are doing to encourage young people. And that, I think, is the legacy.
John, you must look around you in Expedition Base here and think what an incredible career. And it's so lovely to see the physical artefacts all around that represent a lifetime of exploration and service as well. So pick out for me some of your very favourite artefacts that you've collected throughout your career.
We've got a number here. I mean, some pictures of the Just a Drop. That's one of the things I didn't mention earlier, but one of my main interests now is with water charities, and you were talking about helping people overseas, and that's another thing, by taking in a means of giving people clean drinking water, is one of the things I spend a lot of time doing now. And we call it Just a Drop, which is the name of the charity. But you see some of the photographs there. I always think the greatest luxury when you come back from an expedition is to be able to turn on a tap and drink the water that comes out of it, because, of course, in most parts of the world you can't do that. So I would say water is one of the things I hold pretty dear to my heart, particularly when it's mixed with a little whiskey as well.
I would certainly agree with that. You've also collected some historic artefacts along the way as well. Tell me about those.
Well, we've got them on display. One is the compass that Stanley was carrying when he discovered Livingstone, and that was given to me by a lady whose ancestor had been the captain of a Royal Mail ship that was bringing some of Stanley's dispatches back from Africa, and as a keepsake afterwards, Stanley gave him the compass, and it was exhibited at the Empire exhibition, I think, in 1925, and one or two others. And this lady came in and she said, I heard a broadcast you were doing after the Congo River expedition on the BBC, and I have no heir, and I think you should have this compass. And she then produced all the documentation that went with it. And I then approached the Stanley family, who I knew quite well, and they looked at it and they said, yes, this is the one, because we know there were 3 compasses and we've got 2 of them. We often wonder what happened to the third. This is it. This is the hand compass that he would have carried. And there's Stanley's writing is on the bottom. So that's one of my dearest possessions. I mean, there are various other bits of junk, so my wife would call them. I've got a house full of things and various souvenirs that you bring back. Oh, the other thing I should mention is which is not really an object, but it's the voice. After I did a BBC program many years ago, they found Stanley's voice on the BBC archives, and they gave me a copy of it, which I've got on, which you can hear it play, and you hear his Welsh voice coming out. People used to think he was American, but actually he never lost his Welsh accent.
And what does that mean to you, to be able to listen to the voice of one of your exploring forebears?
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, I wish, to actually hear the man speak. It was made on a brass, one of these wax cylinders, so it's not, the quality is not very good, but it's still you can hear what he said. He's actually thanking the Lord Mayor of London for the freedom of the city following the Emin Pasha expedition.
Now, one of the other artefacts that I've seen here is a saddle, but it's a saddle with a difference. It doesn't look terribly comfortable.
The saddle, that is a Mongolian saddle, and the Mongolians ride standing up. So they only sit down in this wooden saddle when they're resting, and so they ride with stiff knees. When I'm riding, I use one like this. But that's actually a Panamanian one. I use that in my horse in Panama, but which is much more endurable. But you end up, if you were riding that wooden one, you'd have a squeaky voice in no time at all.
Well, John, it's been an amazing couple of hours exploring Expedition Base here with you. Thank you so much for your incredible generosity, sharing your experiences and your thoughts, and also your advice to young explorers as well. But from the Royal Scottish Geographical Society and me, Vanessa Collingridge, thank you very much.
Thank you.